Jimmy borrowed Keith Richards' guitar, destroyed it on stage, lost Keith's girl, wrote Ruby Tuesday. May 1966, the Cheetah Club on Broadway and 53rd Street in New York City. The venue could hold 2,000 people, but on this particular night, maybe 40 were scattered across the cavernous space. On stage, Curtis Knight and the Squires were playing their usual set, competent but forgettable blues covers, the kind of music that filled club stages across America without ever making anyone remember it the next morning. But their guitarist was different. He played a right-handed guitar, left-handed, upside down, strings backward. His movements were fluid and aggressive, intimate and explosive. He made sounds come out of that guitar that shouldn't have been possible. And sitting in that nearly empty room, watching with the intensity of someone witnessing a miracle, was a 20-year-old British model named Linda Keith. Linda wasn't just any model. She was the face of British Vogue, striking and dark-haired, part of the swinging London scene that was remaking youth culture. But more importantly to this story, she was the girlfriend of Keith Richards, guitarist for the Rolling Stones, one of the biggest rock bands in the world. Linda had come to New York a month ahead of the Stones' fifth American tour in 3 years. She was a blues fanatic, carrying her own collection of rare 45s wherever she traveled, and she'd come early specifically to check out the New York club scene. She was looking for something real, something raw, something that the increasingly polished rock scene in London was starting to lose. And in that nearly empty club, watching a backup guitarist named Jimmy James play for a mediocre band, she found it. After the set, Linda did something that would change rock and roll history. She invited the guitarist to her table. His name, she learned, was actually Jimi Hendrix. He was 23 years old, from Seattle, and he'd been grinding through the music industry for years, playing backup for Little Richard, for the Isley Brothers, for Joey D and the Starlighters, for anyone who would hire him and pay him enough to eat. He was monumentally talented and completely broke. His own guitar was in a pawn shop because he needed the money more than he needed the instrument. He couldn't even afford to buy it back. That's why he was playing with Curtis Knight, because Curtis had a guitar Jimmy could borrow. That's why he was stuck in mediocre bands despite being better than everyone on stage. Poverty and circumstance were keeping genius trapped. They talked for hours that night. Linda and Jimmy discovered they spoke the same language, the language of blues, of raw emotion translated through music. She told him about the scene in London, about what was happening with the Stones and the Beatles and everyone who was changing rock and roll. He told her about his dreams, about the sounds he heard in his head that he couldn't quite get out through other people's songs, about wanting to lead his own band and play his own music. Linda saw something in Jimmy that no one else had seen, not just talent, but genius waiting to explode. She invited him back to her apartment on 63rd Street, where they stayed up until dawn talking about music, listening to records, imagining possibilities. She played him Bob Dylan's new album, Blonde on Blonde. She introduced him to LSD. She showed him there was a world beyond playing backup in clubs for 40 people. Linda made a decision that night. This guitarist needed to be heard. This guitarist needed help. This guitarist needed a guitar. The next day, Linda went to Keith Richards' hotel room. Keith was on the road with the Stones, somewhere else in America, doing what the Stones did, selling out arenas, living the rock and roll life. In his room, among his things, was a white Fender Stratocaster, a 1963 model, serial number L08573, Olympic white finish, a beautiful instrument, well-maintained, expensive. Linda borrowed it. That's the word she would use later, borrowed, as if she intended to return it, as if what was about to happen was part of any plan. She gave Keith Richards' guitar to Jimi Hendrix. Jimmy couldn't believe it. One day he had nothing, pawning his instrument just to eat. The next day he was holding a Stratocaster that belonged to one of the most famous guitarists in the world. It was like a fairy tale, except Linda was very real, and so was the guitar, and so was the opportunity.
With that white Stratocaster, Jimi formed his own band. He stopped being backup for Curtis Knight. He called himself Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. Linda became his de facto manager, his champion, his believer. She set up showcases. She invited industry people. She was determined to make the world see what she saw. One of those showcases was at Café Au Go-Go in Greenwich Village. Linda had invited Seymour Stein, a producer who would later discover Madonna, to come see Jimi perform. This was the moment. This was the showcase that mattered. Jimi walked on stage carrying Keith Richards' white Stratocaster. The guitar gleamed under the stage lights, pristine and perfect. What happened next, Linda would remember for the rest of her life with a mixture of awe and horror. Jimi played, and he didn't just play, he performed with an intensity that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human experience. He played the guitar behind his head, making it look easy when it should have been impossible. He played it with his teeth, coaxing notes that were somehow both precise and wild. He made love to the guitar, made it scream, made it sing, made it speak in languages that shouldn't exist. The small audience was mesmerized. Seymour Stein, the industry executive Linda had invited, watched with growing fascination. This was something different, something new, something that could change everything. And then, as the music built to a crescendo, the volume getting louder, the energy more frenzied, the performance more ecstatic and overwhelming, Jimi raised Keith Richards' pristine white Stratocaster high above his head. For a moment, the guitar hung in the air, suspended in stage light, beautiful and doomed. Then Jimi brought it down with force onto the stage floor.
The sound of the guitar breaking was almost musical. Wood splintering, strings snapping, the body cracking into pieces. Jimi didn't stop with one hit. He smashed it again and again, destroying it completely, reducing Keith Richards' beautiful instrument to wreckage in service of the performance, in service of the moment, in service of art. Linda sat in the audience, frozen. "I was beside myself," she would say years later, her voice still carrying the shock of that moment. I'd lent him a guitar belonging to my boyfriend, and there he was smashing one up on stage. I was absolutely livid with Jimi, because to me, that's the most uncool thing to do. The guitar was destroyed, pieces of it scattered across the stage, the neck broken, the body splintered. Keith Richards' beautiful white Stratocaster reduced to wreckage in service of Jimi Hendrix's art. Seymour Stein saw the destruction, saw the argument brewing between Linda and Jimi, and fled. The showcase was a disaster. But the image of Jimi destroying that guitar would become part of his legend, part of the mythology that would make him one of the most famous guitarists who ever lived. Linda was furious, but she was also committed. She'd seen what Jimi could do. She knew the guitar smashing was showmanship, part of the performance, part of what would make people remember him. It was uncool, yes. It was disrespectful to the instrument, yes. But it was also unforgettable. She kept trying. She set up another showcase, this time at Café Wah on McDougal Street. She invited Chaz Chandler, former bassist for the Animals who was looking to become a manager. Chandler walked into that basement club, heard Jimi play the opening chords of a song called Hey Joe, and knew immediately he was hearing something special. He was the best guitar player I had ever heard, Chandler would say later. Within weeks, Chandler had convinced Jimi to come to London. He promised him opportunities that didn't exist in America for a black guitarist who wanted to lead his own band. He promised him a chance to play with Eric Clapton. Jimi, who had been struggling in New York for years, agreed.
But before any of that could happen, word got back to Keith Richards. Keith was on tour when he started hearing rumors. His girlfriend Linda was spending a lot of time with an unknown American guitarist. She was giving this guitarist money, connections, attention, and she'd lent this guitarist something that belonged to Keith, his white Stratocaster. By the time Keith heard that the guitar had been destroyed on stage, his relationship with Linda was already falling apart. It wasn't just about the guitar, though the guitar mattered. It was about what the guitar represented. Linda's total commitment to Jimi Hendrix's career at the expense of everything else, including her 3-year relationship with Keith Richards. Keith was hurt. More than that, he was worried about Linda. She'd started using drugs more heavily. She was hanging out with people Keith didn't trust. This wasn't just about a guitar, or even about Jimi. This was about Linda spiraling into a world that Keith, despite his own wild reputation, recognized as dangerous. So Keith did something that sounds almost protective, almost loving, if you squint at it the right way. He called Linda's father. "Your daughter is in trouble," Keith told him. "She's hanging out with bad people. She's in danger. You need to come get her." Linda's father flew to New York immediately. He walked into Cafe A Go-Go during one of Jimi's performances, and Linda looked up from the audience to see her father standing there, looking stern and determined. "I thought, God, that looks like my father," Linda remembered. "He took me by the arm and marched me out." Her father brought her back to England. Keith was waiting. There he was, looking rather smug, Linda said. The relationship was over. Linda told Keith to fuck off. But years later, she would admit, "Keith did do a bit of the dirty on me. But he genuinely felt I was in danger and he could save me. And God bless him, maybe he did." By the time Linda was back in England, Jimi was already on his way to London with Chas Chandler. He would form the Jimi Hendrix Experience. He would record Hey Joe in December 1966. By March 1967, he would be famous throughout Europe. By June, after Monterey, he would be a legend. And Keith Richards? He lost his girlfriend, he lost his guitar, and he lost the woman he would later describe as the one that first broke my heart. But out of that loss came a song. Keith and Brian Jones sat down and wrote a piece of music that tried to capture Linda, her unpredictability, her passion, her inability to be held or defined or kept. They called it Ruby Tuesday. The lyrics are careful, poetic, never mentioning Linda by name, but clearly about her, a woman who changes with every new day, who can't be named or claimed or understood, a woman who chose a struggling guitarist's career over a relationship with the Rolling Stone. Goodbye, Ruby Tuesday. Who could hang a name on you? When you change with every new day, still I'm gonna miss you. The song was released as a single in January 1967, just as Jimi Hendrix was becoming famous in London. It became a massive hit, reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Millions of people heard Keith Richards singing about the woman who left him, though almost none of them knew the real story behind the words. Linda heard it, of course. She knew it was about her. She knew Keith was singing goodbye to what they'd had, what they'd lost. And she knew that she'd made her choice. She'd chosen Jimi's career over her relationship with Keith, and she couldn't regret it, even if it hurt. Jimi and Linda lost touch after he went to London. His management team didn't trust her. They thought she might try to influence him away from the commercial sound they were crafting. She was kept at a distance, and Jimi, caught up in sudden fame and new relationships, didn't fight to maintain contact. But just before his death in September 1970, Jimi reached out to Linda one more time. They met at a club called Speakeasy. Jimi was with his girlfriend, Monica Danneman. Linda was the person he'd thought of, after all the success, after all the fame, after everything. Jimi gave Linda a Fender Stratocaster in an old suitcase, along with letters she'd written to him years before. It was his way of saying thank you for everything she'd done, for believing in him when he was nobody, for giving him Keith's guitar even though it cost her everything, for making it her mission to launch his career. He also told her he'd written a song for her. One of his last compositions before his death was called
Send My Love to Linda. The blues piece was Jimmy's way of acknowledging that Linda had been there at the beginning, that she'd made everything possible. A few weeks later, Jimi Hendrix was dead, 27 years old. The guitar he'd been playing when he died, the instrument that had become synonymous with his revolutionary style, was descended directly from that white Stratocaster Linda had given him, the one that belonged to Keith Richards, the one Jimmy had destroyed on stage at Cafe Au Go-Go. The story of Keith Richards' guitar isn't just about an instrument being destroyed. It's about sacrifice and obsession and the price of believing in someone. It's about a young woman who saw genius in a struggling musician and gave everything to make the world see it too, including her relationship with one of the most famous guitarists alive to help an unknown guitarist become legendary. It's about Keith Richards losing the woman he loved and turning that loss into a song that millions would hear. It's about Jimi Hendrix being given a chance by someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And it's about a white Fender Stratocaster that was destroyed on a stage in Greenwich Village, and somehow, in its destruction, helped create one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. Keith wrote Ruby Tuesday about Linda. Jimmy wrote Send My Love to Linda about Linda. Two of the greatest guitarists of their generation, both writing songs about the same woman, the woman who'd given Keith's guitar to Jimmy, the woman who'd sacrificed her relationship to launch a stranger's career, the woman who'd been there at the moment when rock and roll history pivoted on the destruction of a borrowed instrument. Linda Keith never became as famous as the men she helped create, but without her, Jimi Hendrix might have remained Jimmy James, playing backup in mediocre bands, his guitar forever in a pawn shop. Without her sacrifice, there might never have been an experience, never been a Monterey, never been a legacy that changed how the guitar could be played. And Keith Richards, heartbroken, wrote one of the most beautiful songs of the 1960s about the woman who got away. A goodbye sung to millions, a missing sung to radio listeners, all because a model gave a guitarist a guitar and everything changed. If this story of sacrifice, destruction, and songs born from loss moved you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the most important moments in music history happen when someone believes in the impossible. Have you ever sacrificed something important to help someone else succeed? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video for more untold stories behind music's greatest moments.